Certainly not impossible. I would hope that if this bill was sent back, I know my colleagues would figure out a way to pay for it. I thank the chair and yield the floor.
Senator from Maine.
Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of quorum, but I will be responding.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
We heard Senator Sessions talking about legislation scheduled to come up in the chamber tomorrow. Senators will consider some 34 amendments to the Postal Service bill tomorrow afternoon. Congressional Quarterly writing that several of the amendments would protect rural post offices and delivery stands, including one by Joe Manchin of West Virginia that would prohibit the Postmaster General from closing post offices for 2 years. Any roll call votes on amendments and final passage on the post office bill will require 60 votes for passage. And a quick reminder that live coverage getting underway on C-SPAN with an interview with former Vice President Dick Cheney.
Senator from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that proceedings under the call be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, let me start by responding to the ranking member of the Budget Committee by saying that I could not agree with him more that it is absolutely unacceptable that we have not had a budget pass in the Senate for more than 1,000 days. That is totally unacceptable. It's one of the reasons that we are in such a financial crisis in this country. So I completely agree with Senator Sessions that we should be doing a budget resolution on the Senate floor, and I wholeheartedly agree with his comments that it is absolutely irresponsible for us to be proceeding without a budget resolution. And as a member of the Appropriations Committee, I would say to my colleagues that it makes it very difficult for us to carry out our work due to the cooperation of the chairman and ranking member of that committee. We are operating under allocations for each subcommittee, but it would be far, far preferable if there were a budget resolution that passed, and it should have passed last year, the year before, and it should be passing this year. So we're in complete agreement on that point, and I know that's been a great source of frustration for the senator from Alabama as the ranking member of the Budget Committee. Having said that, Mr. President, let me explain a few facts. First of all, there are no tax dollars being authorized by this reform bill. There is no transfer of taxpayer money to the Postal Service. What we have here is a very strange and unusual budget situation. And the score that CBO has is incredibly misleading because the Postal Service, oddly enough, is part of the unified budget of the United States, even though most of its accounts are off budget. But it participates in federal employee retirement systems and the health benefit systems and the workers' compensation systems, where postal dollars that come from postal employees and from ratepayers, postal ratepayers, are commingled, if you will, with tax dollars that come from other federal agencies into the retirement system, the workers' comp system, and the health benefit system. And that creates this odd situation which makes it very difficult for CBO to score this bill correctly. Now, the Inspector General of the Postal Service puts it far more bluntly. The Inspector General says in a February 22nd report from this year called Budget Enforcement Procedures and the Postal Service, and let me quote, the IG says, the Postal Service's off-budget status exposes the Postal Service to, quote, an inappropriate and illogical application of the scoring process that threatens its ability to reform and heal its financial condition. Scoring and budget enforcement were created for a good purpose, but they are undermined when the scoring process assumes that unlikely or inappropriate inflows to the Treasury must occur, end quote. Let me give you a couple of examples because it's incredibly important that we walk through the score so that our colleagues can understand the unique on-budget, off-budget status of the Postal Service, particularly in the area of reducing payments to retiree health benefits or recovering overpayments to the FERS system, and how the CBO scoring method obscures the true savings achieved by refunding the FERS payments. Now, again, let me repeat. Since 1971, the Postal Service has received no federal subsidy to operate other than some very minor appropriated dollars for functions that the Postal Service is legislatively mandated to do, such as mail for the blind and overseas ballots for our troops. That's it. Prior to 1971, there was a taxpayer subsidy year after year to the Postal Service. That ended with the Postal Reform Act in that year. So from the sale of stamps, the cost of shipping packages, the rates that mailers and magazine publishers, newspaper publishers paid to get the print versions delivered, comes the revenue for the Postal Service. And even the money that the Postal Service uses for retiree benefits comes from the combination of the contributions the postal workers make and the money that the Postal Service invests. So there is, as I mentioned earlier, a significant overpayment into the federal employees' retirement system. And we, along with the administration, the GAO, the independent actuaries, the Postal Service Inspector General, all have proposed that that overpayment be returned to the Postal Service. And it would be used in part to finance these buyouts and retirement incentives to reduce the size of the postal workforce. Now, let's look at how CBO scores this particular part of the bill. First of all, CBO gives this bill no credit whatsoever for the buyouts, and here's why. CBO argues that the Postal Service already has buyout authority. But, Mr. President, as you know better than anybody in this chamber, our bill changes the status quo in two critical ways. First of all, the Postal Service has no cash right now to do these buyouts. That is one of the reasons that we're so eager to get the money from the overpayment to FERS refunded to the Postal Service. Second, in our bill, in our substitute bill, we specifically direct the Postmaster General to use a portion of this money to entice 18% of the current postal workers to accept this offer. That is a big difference. So there's a mandatory direction to the Postmaster General to reduce the workforce by about 18%, and there's the cash that will allow him to offer buyouts to do that. Now, why CBO doesn't score that as a savings to the Postal Service is beyond me. Now, there's another way to reduce the workforce, and again, the funds for this would come from the FERS refund, and that is our bill provides new authority to the Postal Service to offer 1 or 2 years of credited service toward a pension annuity so that some worker who's just lacking a year or two to reach the number of years necessary for retirement could be credited with that extra year or two of service, depending which retirement system the worker is in. Unfortunately, the CBO makes an assumption that only several thousand employees would take advantage of that offer and credits the bill with savings of only $643 million over 10 years. Since these kinds of service credits have never been offered before, it's not clear how the CBO came up with this assumption. There's no precedent for it. There are no data for the CBO to use. And again, our original bill did not include the hard requirement for the 18% reduction, but our substitute does, and yet CBO does not recognize that change. Now, the Postal Service has told us, as the presiding officer would attest, that these requirements and this new authority and the funds for the buyouts and the service credit would allow them to reduce their workforce in the neighborhood of 100,000 employees and save some $8 billion a year. That is not reflected in the estimate. So I use that example because it shows how strange the scoring is. This is a quirk of the budget scoring rules because when there's a transfer of Postal Service money, not taxpayer money, Postal Service money, from one account in the Treasury, such as the retirement account, into an off-budget postal operations account, the CBO makes this assumption that savings are not going to occur. So, when you transfer the $11 billion overpayment, the refund, from the pension account to which the Postal Service has been overcharged into a postal operating account, it gets credited as $5.5 billion instead of $11 billion. That means an on-budget account loses $11 billion, as CBO looks at it, and the off-budget accounts only gains $5.5 billion. This is very complex because it's so obscure and because, frankly, it's so illogical. The result is a net score in the unified budget of $5.5 billion as a cost to the Treasury. And that simply is not the reality. Again, these aren't taxpayer dollars that went into the overpayment in the first place. So here we have a provision that's being scored as a $5.5 billion cost to the Treasury, when in fact they aren't tax dollars. And it's only because this is a unified budget where some of the accounts are on budget, some of the accounts are off budget, that we have this anomalous result. It just doesn't make sense. Let me give you another example. The CBO acknowledges that our reforms of the federal workers' compensation program would save $1.2 billion. But CBO doesn't count this reduction as a savings because of the way that the Department of Labor charges agencies for participation in the workers' compensation program. Again, that just doesn't make any sense when the CBO itself acknowledges that these are real reforms that are going to save $1.2 billion. Yet we only get credit for $200 million of the reforms. Mr. President, there's another issue here. The CBO does not account for what would happen if the Postal Service allows service to continue to deteriorate. Instead, because the CBO doesn't recognize the reality that all the big mailers and small mailers tell us, which is that revenue will be driven out of the system if the service cuts associated with plant closures and wholesale closures of post offices are allowed to proceed. The bottom line, Mr. President, is that were it not for 50% discounts being applied over and over again to the savings that we achieve for 5-day delivery, retiree health care, the pension refund, on the basis of these strange behavioral assumptions and reflecting the odd combination of off-budget and on-budget accounts being brought together in a unified budget, the bill would have scored approximately $24.6 billion more in off-budget savings, making the bill a net saver of $14.8 billion. This is so frustrating, Mr. President, because it is so complex. But I think if our colleagues just look at the example of the FERS overpayment, it becomes very clear. Because there are no taxpayer dollars involved, and yet it is scored as a cost to the Treasury of $5.5 billion. How can a refund of an overpayment that involved no tax dollars end up being scored as the cost to the Treasury of $5.5 billion? That is how illogical and quirky this estimate is. And it is because of the unique status of the Postal Service and how its various accounts are reflected in the budget. But, Mr. President, in addition to my absolute conviction that this score is very misleading, let me make another point, and that is, if we do not proceed with this bill, if this budget point of order brings down this bill, the Postal Service will not survive as we know it. And again, we are not providing a taxpayer subsidy in this bill. In fact, I would argue we're preventing a taxpayer bailout in this bill. Because later this year, if the Postal Service cannot meet its payroll and thus is unable to deliver mail, I think the pressure for the taxpayer bailout will increase substantially. And I do not want to see us return to the pre-1971 era where the taxpayers were on the hook for the Postal Service. And our bill would avoid that outcome. Thank you, Mr. President.
May I say that in my from Maine wish to speak?
Mr. President, I don't know if this would be appropriate, so I'm going to suggest the absence of quorum to find out whether I could replace the presiding officer and the chair very briefly so that he could add his comments to this issue. But if that's going to create an issue, then I don't want to proceed.
We have someone coming at 1:30.
You do? Okay. Mr. President, I'm informed by the staff of the floor that there will be a new presiding officer arriving in moments, so I will just suggest the absence of a quorum and take my seat.
And I will just ask the clerk to call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, I thank the Chair. I'd ask unanimous consent that further proceedings under the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, thank you for liberating me from the chair so I may now speak in my capacity as a senator from Connecticut. I want first to thank my friend from Maine, Senator Collins, for what I thought was a very convincing, insightful description and really a critique of the CBO estimate of the financial impact of this bill. This is tough to follow. The two of us, Senator Collins and I and others on the committee, have been deeply saturated in this for probably too long. But the fact is, when the CBO estimate of the bill came out saying that it was going to cost more than we were saving, I was shocked. And as I read over it, part of it is because they're not simply considering the post office, the Postal Service budget, which we're out to save, that is, to cut a lot of money from it so that it can be saved. But they're, and as Senator Collins said, the Postal Service is off budget. It doesn't spend taxpayers' money except for those two little matters of paying for ballots for military personnel and others overseas, and I think the other was for blind people in this country. But the rest of it is all paid by the ratepayers. And as you go over one by one, as Senator Collins did, the elements of the costs, and I put them with quotations around them, they're just not real. This is form over substance. This is a kind of Alice in Wonderland accounting that doesn't relate to the reality of the Postal Service's budget or the federal budget. I mean, the so-called FERS repayment that's coming from the federal government is everyone agrees, including Senator Sessions, who stated his intention to make a budget point of order on our bill, on our postal rescue bill, that the Postal Service did overpay this amount of money, just as if a taxpayer had overpaid taxes. Well, that's if I overpaid my taxes, that's my money that I'm asking for back from the government. In this case, the Postal Service has overpaid to the federal pension, retiree pension fund, and it's asking for its money back. There's something else to be said here about the reality of accounting in the real world. When the approximately $11 billion, it may be more, is paid back to the Postal Service, that only happens once, when that total is paid back. But what we have demanded in the bill be done with a part of that money, which is to get involved in this incentive to early retirement or retirement when one is eligible, members of the Postal Service, mandating that 18%, about 100,000 postal employees retire. That saves $8.1 billion on a recurring basis every year. So you've got the one-time, may come in 2 or 3 payments, but only one-time $11 billion repayment to the Postal Service for the overpayment it made, and then every year it saves $8.1 billion forever. That's a pretty good deal for the both for the taxpayers and the Postal Service. Secondly, and Senator Collins went on, I think, very effectively about this, the pre-funding of health benefits. The fact is that in the Postal Reform Act of 2006, you might call it an excess of caution, the Postal Service was required to make payments into the Retiree Health Benefits Fund that are greater than most any other business or government in the country. And we've just spread this out to a 40-year payment schedule according to the normal discount rate that other federal programs pay for their retirees' benefits. Senator Collins talked at length about the impact of the way in which the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, refuses to score, as we say, count dollar for dollar the amount of money saved by early retirement, which doesn't make any sense because that is what will be saved. Now, I want to enter into the record at this point and speak to it. The estimate of the United States Postal Service about what our substitute bill 1789 will save. And it's quite dramatic. All along, our goal has been to get to a point over 3 or 4 years where we would save as close to $20 billion a year as we could. That's the number that Postmaster General Donahoe gave to our committee as what he needed, the Postal Service needed to get back in balance. On the current course, in the fiscal year 2016, the U.S. Postal Service will lose, I'm reading now from a statement which I'll enter into the record that Postal Service has given us, will have a deficit of $21.3 billion. In 2016, under, okay, I got the right number, under the passage of the substitute 1789, the loss is reduced to $1.8 billion. That's from 21.3 to 1.8. Well, of course, we want to get it to total balance, but we're clearly going to hit balance after that on the course we're on. That means that according to the Postal Service, that the passage of S-1789, our substitute bill, will save the Postal Service over $19 billion a year by 2016. And that's exactly what the Postal Service needs to stay alive. And we do it without compelling layoffs. We do it with incentives to retirement. We do it without mandating, as some of the amendments we'll vote on tomorrow, the mass closure of mail processing facilities or our post offices around the country, which, as Senator Collins has said, would a kind of shock therapy, would so jolt the system that people would turn away from the post offices in increasing numbers, and in fact it would accelerate the loss of revenue. And we do it without an immediate move from 6 days of delivery to 5 days, because that's a tough one for a lot of people. We've given the post office 2 years to essentially prove that it can get back in balance without that move from 6 days to 5 days of delivery. So, and we've added new sources of revenue, and we've created a process here which isn't scored by the Postal Service that we think can add more money because it'll develop a new business model, a new way to use the assets that the Post Office has to make more money. The fact is that I want to just emphasize this again. This saving of $19 billion, which will result by 2016, if this substitute bill 1789 is adopted, does not take any taxpayer funds. In fact, it properly returns certain overpayments from the Postal Service. The CBO score for S-1789 is simply misleading, profoundly misleading, because of the kind of accounting rules that don't relate to the reality of the budget for the Postal Service. And so I'm proud of what we've been able to accomplish. It took a lot of work. And Senator Collins has said if this point of order that Senator Sessions intends to make at some point in the debate, hopefully after the amendments are voted on, is sustained, it will end this bill. And instead of, therefore, having adopted a bill which, if it went all the way to enactment, would save $19 billion for the Post Office every year by 2016, the Post Office's deficit debt spiral would continue downward. I would predict that there'd be massive cutbacks in services and loss of employment by people both in the Postal Service, but particularly among the 8 million people who are in jobs that depend on the Postal Service in the private sector for their livelihood. So, with all respect, I will vigorously object to the point of order that my friend from Alabama, Senator Sessions, will make. Mr. President, I note the presence on the floor of the distinguished senator from Virginia. Does he wish to speak? I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The junior senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, first of all, let me thank the chairman and Senator Collins for their work on this bill. I know it has caused a great deal of interest and consternation, but the numbers are overwhelming that without this kind of legislation, the fate of our Postal Service would be in great jeopardy. And I want to commend both the chair and the ranking member for their very good work. I intend to support the legislation. Know they've had to make some hard choices, but I think they are putting the Postal Service back on the path to sustainability and want to commend their leadership. I also want to thank them both as well for an amendment that they've been kind enough to include, and I believe in the revised bill or the manager's package, that takes on a related issue that affects not only postal employees but all federal employees, and that is the absolutely dreadful performance that's starting to be corrected, but the absolutely dreadful performance that OPM and agencies of the government, including the Post Office, have done in terms of making sure that our federal employees receive their retirement benefits in a timely manner. The presiding officer and I, both from the Commonwealth of Virginia, we have 130,000 federal employees in Virginia. There are 140,000 federal employees across the river in Maryland, and I'm happy that Senator Mikulski has co-sponsored the amendment that I'm going to talk about in a few moments. I want to explain the problem we're facing and why I'm asking the Senate to pass this amendment during the consideration of its bill to reform the postal system. Over the past year, I and other members in both parties have received hundreds of requests for assistance from federal retirees who have experienced significant delays in obtaining their full retirement benefits, delays that oftentimes exceed 12 months, sometimes as much as 18 months and more. In the meantime, these federal retirees, and no one questions that they deserve and should receive these benefits, but since there's slow processing and antiquated technology, they're not getting to these earned retirement benefits. These retirees face inordinate hardships trying to pay their bills and survive on partial payments while the requirement paperwork moves through the system. Remarkably, in 2012, our whole retirement system is still a paper-based system. OPM also relies upon every other federal agency, like the Post Office and others where a federal employee works, to assemble and submit the retiree's paperwork in a timely and efficient manner. But as we've seen with the occasional snapshots that have been taken, some agencies literally have a 30 to 50% error rate in submitting the background materials for the retiree so that OPM can appropriately process their paperwork. And part of the goal of this postal reform, I know, is going to be to encourage some of the voluntary retirements in the postal system. Again, why this amendment is so timely. Meanwhile, the retirees wait and wait for benefits that they've earned, and unfortunately, benefits that they can't get access to. We continue to hear from recent federal retirees who literally spend 8 or 10 hours a day trying to get through on the customer service line to find out where their benefits are. I'd like to share a few examples of what we're hearing. We recently heard from a retired colonel from Williamsburg, Virginia, who wrote, quote, "When I retired in March 2011, and at the time of this writing, OPM has still not figured out my full retirement pay. My savings are getting low." From here in Northern Virginia and Dumfries, Virginia, we heard from a federal employee, retiree, who said, "I have been subjected to severe financial hardship because of not getting my full benefits. I was recently told that the bank is repossessing my auto because I cannot afford to make the payments. And they're not able to make the payments because this retiree was not getting her benefits. She was existing on partial benefits until OPM could deal with the processing. From Warrenton, I am seeking assistance with obtaining my husband's health insurance, which was canceled unexpectedly. He worked for DOD. I notified OPM with the appropriate forms and a copy of his death certificate, all of which was apparently lost by OPM. I tried to obtain new forms, but was told that it would take up to 6 weeks. I am 80 years old and need my health insurance now. My husband and I were married for 60 years. This is just unacceptable. This is not the way we ought to be running this important part of our federal government. In January of 2012, OPM's retirement backlog exceeded 62,000 cases. 62,000 federal employees, retirees, who were waiting to get their benefits in a backlog. And again, let me point out, many of these retirees were waiting for more than a year. We saw huge backlogs in disability claims, death benefits, and court-ordered benefits. By OPM's own account, it takes almost 700 days, nearly 2 years, to process some death benefits. Now, recently, after my meetings with OPM and other members of the delegation, OPM has made some limited progress in reversing the tide of retirement claims. The retirement backlog is now at 52,000 claims. And OPM has hired new staff and is starting to modernize its outdated processes. But it is clear that more needs to be done. Now, I want to also compliment Senator Kaka, who was kind enough to allow me to join an oversight hearing on this matter back in February of this year. What I heard there worried me. So I sent my staff to OPM's retirement processing facility last month to see the problem up close. Unfortunately, my staff reports confirmed my worst fears. The current process is largely manual, cumbersome, and contributes to significant delays and potential errors. We've been told that the newest OPM technology is 12 years old. That's pretty remarkable. It's simply no longer feasible to expect that manual data entry for retirement and benefits claims makes sense when we have technology that can dramatically lower processing time and increase accuracy. OPM needs to modernize its technology in the long run. But in 2012, they need to at least start taking some short-term steps. It is just unacceptable that they rely upon paper processing in 2012. OPM, as I mentioned, has made some progress, but ultimately they still want to remain committed to a paper processing system. Doesn't make any sense. Then the kicker is, this problem is not new. As indicated by this press story, federal agencies have routinely pointed their finger of blame at OPM for causing these delays, while OPM points a finger back at the individual agencies for not getting the information to OPM in a timely manner. Now, we might think that this story was written just in the last few weeks. There have been actually stories written in the Post in the last few weeks about this subject. But the day I'm quoting from on this story, actually, that May 19th, 1988. That's 24 years ago. Ronald Reagan was president when this was written. And we've had 4 presidents since then. Yet OPM continues to offer the same excuses and the same kind of back-and-forth finger-pointing between agencies. We've seen this show before, and it needs to be taken off the air. So, what are we going to do with this amendment, and how does this affect trying to move the ball forward? My amendment will do 3 things. First, it requires OPM to report to Congress, GAO, and the public about the timeliness and accuracy of Postal Service claims, requiring OPM to compare the Postal Service with performance of all other federal agencies. So we need to figure out, because we don't know at this point with that 52,000 claim backlog, whether the backlog is because the agency that the employee worked for didn't get the information to OPM in a timely manner, or whether OPM hasn't processed this. This amendment will require the Postal Service to assess how it's doing getting this information to OPM and compare that with performance of other federal agencies. This will allow us to see which federal agencies have the best and worst track records in submitting paperwork to OPM. The snapshot we saw a little bit earlier this year at the hearing in February showed that a number of agencies had literally a 30 to 50% error rate in submitting their retirement paperwork to OPM. And with close to 100,000 potential new retirees, actually a much larger number, but the effect of this bill may urge the voluntary retirement of 100,000 postal workers to retirement. OPM is going to get hit by a tsunami. Second, the report will also require OPM to provide a claims aging report. We need to know how long retirement applications have been pending at OPM. By the way, we don't have any of that information right now for the 52,000 cases that are currently pending backlog. No basic aging report. And third, the amendment will require OPM to at least move forward a little bit in modernizing one piece of their technology so that OPM can at least receive some electronic payroll data from the Postal Service system. 551,000 people work for the Postal Services right now. And if this legislation passes, which I hope it will, and we see the voluntary retirement of 100,000 postal workers over the coming months or year, that is a new tsunami of retirement benefits claims that are going to need to be processed by OPM. The bottom line is this. You know, OPM, while they are trying to make some progress, and I commend Director Berry for some of the actions he's taken, we need to urge them along and get more data about how they do not only with the Postal Services, but with all federal agencies. My amendment will move forward in that direction. The Warner-Mikulski amendment focuses on these key reporting requirements and mandates more transparency so that we can untangle the choke points. I believe that we need to honor the dedication and commitment of our federal workforce, including our postal workers, and making sure that when they do retire, they get their federal retiree benefits in a timely and efficient manner. Again, Mr. President, I want to thank the chair and the ranking member for their hard work on this postal reform bill. I look forward to supporting it. I also hope that my colleagues will join me in supporting this Warner-Mikulski amendment that, while tangential to the overall reform of the Postal Service, making sure that these retirees get their benefits in a timely manner is something we should all agree on. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, I thank my friend from Virginia most importantly for focusing our attention. I know Senator Collins and Senator Cock have also been involved in this, on this really unacceptable situation where federal employees are retiring because of a lot of failures here, the failure to implement an effective, it's 2012, an effective electronic system for this purpose, paper processing, meaning that people have to wait these very long times after they retire, and while they're waiting, they're getting a significantly reduced benefit, which causes real hardship. And the senator from Virginia is absolutely right. We mandate here that in this bill, the underlying bill, that the Postal Service accept the goal of 18% in reduction of workforce. The total number of career employees in the U.S. Postal Service is about 545,000. 18% comes out to around 100,000, which is our goal for reduction. And this has to happen if the Postal Service is going to get back in balance because, as Senator Collins said earlier today, 80% of the operating budget of the Postal Service is personnel costs. Obviously, it's a labor-intensive operation, but so you're going to have another 100,000 people. In fact, it keeps going, and by 2017, you'll have, from now, this year, you'll have a total of 138,000 postal employees eligible to retire, and the Postal Service just going to have to work to incentivize them to retire so that the service overall can stay in balance. I want to thank Senator Warner because we've worked very well together on a modification to his amendment, which I think most significantly will require the Office of Personnel Management to submit a report to Congress related to the completion of retirement claims for postal annuitants, to keep the pressure on them to end this really inhumane, in many cases, certainly unacceptable situation. And I know when the proper time comes, we intend to support this modified amendment. It strengthens the bill. It does the right thing. And I thank the Senator from Virginia for expressing his intention to support the overall bill. I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. President. I, too, want to commend the senator from Virginia for offering this amendment in conjunction with the senator from Maryland. I wrote to OPM in July of last year about this very issue. I was very concerned about reports from my own state and from the Washington Post about the tremendous backlog at OPM in processing the retirement applications of federal and postal workers. And this is just wrong. And as the senator's statement shows, it has caused some real hardship to individuals. And so I was pleased that the chairman and I could work with the senator to modify his amendment so that it would be germane to this bill. And I look forward at the appropriate time with working with the chairman to accept the amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, I just want to thank the chair and the ranking member for their working with me on this amendment to get it appropriately modified. This is an area that I think there is broad bipartisan consensus that we need to make sure, whether postal workers or other workers in the federal system, that when they choose to retire, they can expect those retirement benefits in a timely manner. And I want to again commend the chair and the ranking member for the fact that putting in place this very reasonable plan that's going to encourage the voluntary retirements of that approximate 18% of the workforce, 109,000, I believe it amounts to. It's going to be a lot easier to make that sell if those postal workers can then expect to receive their retirement benefits in a timely manner. I think if they're hearing the current scuttlebutt that they may have to wait 12 to 18 months to get their retirement benefits, it becomes a much harder effort for the postmaster and the management of the postal system to make, even if they've got the right incentives in place, to kind of get over that hump if they have to wait a long time. So I very much want to thank, again, the chair and the ranking member, Senator Lieberman, Senator Collins, for their support on this. And I think trying to shine a little light on this, not only on the postal system, but also how vis-a-vis other federal agencies are doing, will be important. And I look forward to working with them. I know they both have focused on this issue in the past, and I hope to lend my assistance to make sure we get this fixed. Thank you, Mr. President.
The senator is recognized.
Mr. President, again, thanks to Senator from Virginia. He makes a really important point here. Of the $19 billion in savings that the Postal Service itself believes will result annually as of 2016, $8.1 billion will come from the reduction in salaries paid because of retirements that are incentivized under this bill. And it's common sense that if workers thinking about retiring hear that there's such a backlog that they're only going to get half of what they deserve for their pension until the paperwork is cleared, they're probably not going to rush to retire, and therefore we're going to save less money. So very good point. Mr. President, we're approaching the hour of 2. According to the unanimous consent that governs our activities today here in the Senate, we're going to go to another matter, the NLRB rule. I want to thank particularly Senator Sessions, Senator Warner, who came to the floor to discuss their amendments. Senator Collins and I will return at 4. We'll be here till 5 when we go to judicial a discussion of a judicial nomination, and then we'll be here after the vote tonight, as late as anybody's here, to discuss and debate amendments before we go to the vote tomorrow. So I thank the chair very much. I thank my friend from Maine, and I would yield the floor. Then I'd suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senators have been talking about the Postal Service bill. Votes on that legislation are scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. The Chamber is also debating today whether to move forward on the Violence Against Women Act. A Congressional Quarterly writes that the measure has general bipartisan support, but Republicans have expressed concern about several provisions, saying the measure would not provide proper accountability, provides temporary visas to some undocumented workers, and grants new authority for tribal courts. Senators and aides in both parties have anticipated that that bill, the Violence Against Women Act, will reach the floor after the Postal Service bill.
Senator from Wyoming is recognized.
I'd ask that further proceedings under the quorum call be waived.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I would make a motion to proceed